Hi Dragonflies, we're going to start by putting down our clean puppy training pad. This one has a little dot of dried paint from a previous session, but it's trapped in the inner layers so it won't cause a problem. And then I have my sheet of watercolor paper and a waterproof support board to put it on. I'm using a piece of plexiglass. We're going to start by putting our watercolor paper face down. So if your paper has a side that you prefer to paint on, or if you've done any sort of drawing already, that goes face down. You're going to be working on the back. I'm going to use clear water and a soft brush like a hake that carries lots of water to add clear water to the entire back of this piece of paper. I'm using a lot of water. I'm not wiping my brush off. I actually want a film of water sitting up on the surface of the paper. You can see how it's sort of puddling there. So plenty of water. Make sure there's no dry spots. Don't try to spread it too far. Use lots of water. I'm trying to go just up to the edge and not over the edge, but I want to make sure I do wet the entire edge. The reason for using the puppy training pad instead of just a towel or some other cloth is that these are designed with a surface layer that immediately wicks the moisture down into an inner layer, and the top stays almost dry. So if you drip water on it, it goes very quickly down inside. This means it's unlikely to run underneath the edge and wet the front of the paper, even if you accidentally get quite a bit off the edge. So I make sure I do wet the entire edge. I don't worry terribly much if my brush goes a little bit over the edge. As long as I don't have a huge amount of water there on the edge, it will get trapped in the puppy training pad. So we want quite a lot of water on the back. It would, if I picked it up, it would run right off. Hopefully you can see how wet this is. And we're going to allow this water to sit on the back and absorb into the paper for a while. How long? I'm afraid I can't answer that because it depends on the brand of paper you're using and the humidity in your studio. So you'll have to conduct your own experiments and see how long it takes in your studio for your brand of paper for whatever the humidity is at this time of the year. But you can tell whether the paper is saturated enough by feeling how floppy it is. So if I curl up one corner of this page, you can see that it's still sort of stiff. It sort of holds its shape. And what I'm looking for is getting it to the point where it wants to sort of flop back down in place. If you do make a little crease like I did when you're testing it, you might want to bend it back the other way so that it lays completely flat and the water stays on that portion as well. You also want to keep an eye on it as it's drying, and if you notice any areas that don't appear to have a complete film of water on top, if they're drying out at all, go ahead and add some more water. You want to make sure there's plenty of water on the back so that the entire sheet gets completely saturated. Okay, so after about 8 minutes or so, my piece of paper is feeling floppy enough, and now I'm going to simply pick it up and place it face up on my support board. And you'll notice that usually it doesn't completely flatten out. So with clean, dry hands, you can flatten it out. Be careful that you're not squeezing a lot of water out on the sides. If you do squeeze them out, take a paper towel and wipe it up so that you're not, again, getting water on the front. The front surface is still completely dry, but the inner layers of the paper are completely saturated with water. And there's actually a film underneath usually that will help keep them saturated as you're working. And it sticks on the board by surface tension, so you don't have to tape it down or anything. If you notice any air bubbles, you can pick it up from one corner and reposition it, lay it back down flat so that you get all the air bubbles out. And you can see there's still quite a bit of water on the back of this paper, and that's what we want. The moisture in the inner layers of the paper and on that back side will dramatically slow down the drying of our washes. But the cool thing about this is as long as there is no water on the surface on the front, it's going to act like dry paper when we work on it. So for example, here I'm going to use one of my favorite little techniques for trees where I spritz the paper very lightly with droplets, not a mist, so that I have little drops of water, and then I'm dropping the paint in and it moves with those little drops of water. I'm not going to explain that technique here. If you want to see more about it, I'll put a link in the video description to where you can find some more information about that particular technique. The important thing to notice here is that the paper surface behaves the way dry paper would. When I put down a single dot of paint, it stays put, it doesn't spread out. It only moves if it happens to hit one of those dots of clear water. And this is helpful for this particular technique because when you do this technique, those little droplets of water tend to evaporate before you've got your whole tree done. So if you want a little more working time, having that saturated surface allows those little droplets to stay on the surface longer and give you more time to create that broken edge that I want for the tops of my trees. Okay, so that's all great, but what if you don't finish the entire painting in a single session? Or if you need to let this paint that you've put on the surface dry before you do the next step? So if you interrupt yourself in the middle, which I usually do my painting in stages, I'm going to carefully remove the painting from the board and lay it back on the puppy training pad. But before I do that, I want to make sure that when I lift it off, no surface paint goes running around. So the first thing I do is check to see if there's any water up on the surface. And if there is, I'm going to use a hairdryer to dry it just to the point that I lose that sheen of water on the surface. While I'm using my hairdryer, I want to make sure that I don't start drying the sheet unevenly because uneven drying is part of what causes paper to buckle. So I'm going to keep my hairdryer pretty far away, move it around quite a bit, and dry just to the point where there's no paint that's going to run when I pick the sheet up. Unfortunately, my recording stopped for some reason, so I'll show you this next step with the blank sheet of paper. I'm going to lift it off my support board and carefully lay it down to dry on a puppy training pad. I actually usually move it to a different one somewhere else, but I'll go ahead and use this one since that's where the camera is aimed. The puppy training pad absorbs any surface moisture on the back side, and that helps even out the drying and also prevent any water that collects around the edges from creating a bloom, which can happen if you leave it on your painting support board. When you come back later, it will be mostly flat, but not completely. Not a problem. All you need to do is flip it over and repeat the same process of wetting the back. And I should have moved my painting support board out of the way and done this right on the puppy training pad. And I get distracted when I'm making videos, so I didn't do that. So don't make the mistake I did. In most cases, it won't be a problem. Even if you do it on your painting support board, the water won't run around onto the front beyond maybe a quarter of an inch or so. But even that can be kind of annoying. So better to put it on the puppy training pad instead of making the mistake I made here. But basically, we're just repeating the same step that we did at the very beginning. We're going to wet the entire back, let it sit for a while until it's saturated, flip it over, and continue with our painting. One small problem that you may run into when you're re-wetting the back is that because it was a little bit wrinkled and I didn't happen to stay and watch, I had an area that wasn't as wet as the rest, and you can see that in a little bubble here. So what I've done is to make sure that I've dried all the water from around the outside edge, and I'm just laying another support board on top of it to help it flatten out and kind of contain the water so that it can't evaporate from the front. This will help it even out. You have to be careful about this. You want to make sure you're not squishing water out the sides and having it come over the edges. So if you are going to put another board on top, make sure to do as I am doing here and wipe all that excess water from around the edges so no water will get squished out onto the front surface of your painting before you put the other support board on top of it. If you just have a little bubble or wrinkle along the edge, you can sometimes just pick up the paper and lay it back down, kind of stick that back in place and get it flat enough to continue working. But it's best to actually take your time and let it really get saturated again the second time before you begin your second work session. The thing that goes wrong most often with this technique is not being patient enough and not letting the paper get saturated fully before you flip it over and start working. And then if it's not fully saturated, it will still buckle, because what makes watercolor paper buckle is uneven amounts of moisture in different parts of the paper. So if some of it's saturated and some of it's not, that's when you're going to get buckling. If there's no paint on the surface that might run, you can try picking up the back and adding some water to the back to get some of those little bubbles to stick down too. But again, best to actually let it get fully saturated before you begin your second work session. Fortunately, little bubbles or ripples like this when you're coming back for a second or third work session are usually not a big problem, because at that point you're usually not laying a big wash over a large area where the paint might puddle or pool or not run where you want it to go. If you are going to be laying a larger wash, or the ripples are in a bad place and you really do need to have that page completely flat before you start your next work session, the very best solution is to take it off the support board, put it back on the puppy pad, let it dry completely, come back and start fresh once it's dry, re-wetting the back, and be a little more patient this time. Every method for keeping watercolor paper from buckling has pros and cons. This is one of the disadvantages of this one. If you're impatient and you don't get your paper fully saturated, you really have to wait until the front is dry before you can flip it over and completely saturate it from the back. So this does have some disadvantages. This is one reason why I often stretch my paper on stretcher bars, where I don't have to be so patient with my second and third work session. On the other hand, this really does give you lots of extra working time if you're doing something like this, where I want to keep those little droplets of water on the surface for a long time. Or say you're doing florals or portraits where you want to create a very soft, smooth curve, and you want to lay your wash very slowly and carefully so you get that gradation in just the right places. So even if this isn't the method that you prefer, maybe you don't use a lot of water and most of the time working on a block or taping down your paper works for you, or maybe you're like me and you use lots of water and you typically stretch your paper on stretchers, this is a good one to have in your arsenal for those times when you really would like to have some extra working time. It's great for that, even if it's not your favorite method of keeping the paper flat. Because the paper doesn't always dry completely flat with this method, you may have some ripples in the finished painting that you want to remove before framing. One way you can do this is by ironing them out. So I've put my painting face down on a clean cloth on a surface that can tolerate the permanent press setting on my iron. And the paper can actually tolerate the cotton setting, but I'm using this lower setting so that I can dry it more gradually. What we want to have happen is to get the paper to have a uniform moisture content as it dries. That's what allows it to dry flat. So I keep the iron moving. I'm trying to be patient, not iron it too quickly, and that's going to be the best way to remove the wrinkles. Normally this will work to remove pretty much all of the ripples. Or we can do a variation of what we did at the beginning of each of our work sessions, put the painting face down on a clean surface, and this time we don't really need to saturate it, we just need to get the moisture evened out. So I'm going to mist the back, and then I'll just wipe up any overspray, again, just as insurance that I don't have any puddles that will go underneath and get on the front side of my painting. I'm going to put a layer of paper towels down on top of the painting. This will also help to even out the moisture as it dries. And then I'm just going to weight it down with something to keep it flat while it dries. Usually I just put a painting support board on top. I didn't happen to have one available this size, so I'm using a package of 10 sheets of watercolor paper, which will also work to flatten things out. It doesn't have to be a huge amount of weight. It just needs to keep everything flat and slow down the drying so that the moisture content of the paper has a chance to even out. That's really what helps it relax and flatten out. You want to leave it at least a couple of hours. I usually just leave it overnight. When you come back and remove your weight and your paper towels, it will be nice and flat. If it's not completely flat, you can just mist the back again, put your paper towels and your weight back on, let it sit a little longer. And now you have a flat painting ready to frame. I prefer this method over ironing. It just seems easier, but if you don't have time to wait for this method, you can also iron a watercolor to get it flat. So there you go, an alternative to stretching your paper that allows you to work on flat paper and extends your working time when you're doing things where you'd like a little more time before the wash dries.